Rose. So it's been a long time since I've recorded a new video, but it's time for chapter 17 of Shaking the Nickel Bush, which I have been reading with Isaac and Eva, and now we're all caught up to where I was on my last recording, so I'm going to resume here so everyone can listen. Here we go. Chapter 17 is called Ladies' Man Lonnie. The cuff of my Levi's was empty when we left El Paso, and the roll of bills in my pocket was just about as big around as my thumb. But I thought I'd learned one lesson I'd never forget. Big cities were places to go broke in, not to make money in, particularly since Lonnie had become a Beau Brummel and ladies' man. It had cost me $5 a day spending money just to keep him out from under my feet. Thanks, dog. I'd foolishly established the rate that first day in Lordsburg when I'd given him a 5 by mistake, and once he'd ascended to that standard of living, I couldn't cut him down without breaking both his pride and his heart. I had another lesson to learn, and it didn't take me long to learn it. Isolated towns weren't too good for my new business either. The smaller the town, so long as it had a banker, the surer I was of getting a job. But if I took them one at a time, I'd be all winter rebuilding the treasury in the cuff of my Levi's. From the constant working with clay day after day, my eye had become sharp enough and my fingers deft enough that I could knock out any ordinary model in 5 or 6 hours. But even though I was lucky enough to have bright sunshine and a dry breeze, it required at least 2 more days for the mold and casting to be dry enough that I could finish the job. Worse still, there was nothing for us to do except clean our saddles, practice throwing our ropes, or something like that, while we were waiting for the plaster to dry. I made the mistake of doing an isolated job like that at the first town we struck north of El Paso. After his week of high living in the city, Lonnie was a pest. We were still within an hour's drive of El Paso, so he thought I should give him a $5 every day and let him go back to entertain his girlfriends. Of course I wouldn't, and I tried to ignore his pestering while I was shaping the clay model, but it finally got on my nerves and I lost my temper. Your trouble is that you need work, and if I hear any more of this pestering, you're going to get it, I told him crossly. I'll sell shiftless and take in some old rattletrap in trade, and then you'll have something to keep you out of my hair. Lonnie couldn't have been any more shocked and bewildered if he'd been listening to a judge pronounce his death sentence. Jeepers creepers, buddy, he whispered. You wouldn't do nothing like that. She's our nothing, I told him. She's my flivver, and I'll do whatever I please with her. Since we struck Lordsburg, you've blown more than $60 playing the big shot and ladies' man. I'm not squawking about the money. You had it coming to you, but I am squawking about your blowing it on the dames. It was your money. I wasn't going to tell you what you could do with it, but if you'd turn part of it on shiftless, you could say our flivver. As it is, you've got nothing to say about what happens to her. Lonnie didn't get right down on his knees, but I was afraid he was going to. Honest to God, Bunny, honest to God, he told me. I'd have turned every dime of it in if you'd have said the word. Look, buddy, look, I'll get me a job, washing dishes or anything. Honest, buddy, I ain't going to ask you for another dime out of the business, not for nothing, even makin's. Look, buddy, give me 1 more week, will you? I promise you all. Nobody could have stayed mad at Lonnie long, I least of all. Okay, I told him, I won't sell her till you start pestering again, but the minute you do, she's a goner. Why don't you go for a good long walk? This would be a cracking good day for a hike. Lonnie took it off as though he were afraid I'd changed my mind again, and when I went back to work on the model, I couldn't help feeling sorry for the way I'd jawed at him. A walk for Lonnie would be just about as entertaining as pounding mud into a rat hole. And with all this talk about getting a job, how could he if he were going to keep running around from town to town while I hunted out bankers who would be flattered to have a marble-like bust of what I thought they might have looked like in their youth? Although I'm sure Lonnie spent most of the day sitting in the shade of some bush, not more than half a mile from camp, he didn't come back till late afternoon, just soon enough to drive me into town for my client's okay on the clay model. But by that time I'd had a chance to do considerable thinking, and on the way back I told him, we're going back to doing our business the way we did it in that little canyon west of Safford. We'll make camp at some place where there are at least half a dozen towns within 25 or 30 miles, then we'll spend a day getting jobs, and I'll have the customers bring their pictures to camp, and come back for the finished busts. In that way, I'll have clay models to work on while the plaster molds and castings are drying, and if we can get orders enough, I could turn out 1 a day. Your part of the business will be to tend camp, do all the cooking except the gluten bread, and to drive me wherever I have to go. Then you'll get $5 from each job. You can pay half the gas and grub bill and do whatever you like with the rest of it. Is that a fair deal? Lonnie nearly let Shiftless run off the road as he hugged an arm around my neck and told me I was his buddy, but I couldn't help feeling guilty, for he thought we were going straight 50-50. I never told him I got more than $10 a bust, and I didn't have any intention of letting him find out. If I did, we'd split even, and we split even. He'd only spend the money on girls, and then would go broke if the bottom should fall out of our business. Of course, I hadn't told Lonnie all my plans, but there was no need of that. No one had to tell me that we'd been lucky in the area around Safford. There I hadn't had to do any selling at all. Mabel had started the ball rolling for me. Then one banker had told another, and all I'd done was come to visit with my clients when they came to see me, collect $25 in a tintype from each one, show him the clay model when it was ready, and deliver the plaster bust when he came back for it. I couldn't expect that sort of luck everywhere we went, and I couldn't expect bankers to fork over $25 before they'd seen my work, no matter how many letters of recommendation I might show them. I'd have to have a sample of my work to show, and then I'd have to tell them there would be no payment required unless they were well pleased with the finished marble-like bust. There would be some risk that a finished piece might be refused, but I felt I couldn't afford to take it, for I'd never made a likeness that didn't please my client. Even if I did have one or two finished busts refused, the lost time would be much more than made up for by that saved in travel. The thing that bothered me the most was what I'd used for a sample. The first time I'd used a little horse's head, but it didn't seem like a good plan to show a banker a horse's head and tell him I could make one just like that of you. It wasn't until I began putting the mold plaster on the model that I'd made the day before I'd got the right idea. I'd just put the first couple of flecks over the eyes and ears when Lonnie came hurrying toward me, calling, "Aw, buddy, leave me sling some of it at the old buzzard. I ain't had a chance to sock one of 'em since we left Safford." He socked to beat the band, and his face lit up like a sunrise as he wanged on one handful after another. I just watched his expression and let him keep right on until there wasn't a speck of clay showing, and by that time I knew just the right model for my sample. That is, if I could catch that expression a few times more and was able to work it into the clay. During the time we'd been in town, Lonnie had seldom got up before 10 o'clock, but the next morning he was up by sunrise. He had a fire built and the coffee water on to boil before I was up, and for the first time since I'd known him, he washed the breakfast dishes. I didn't offer to help, but set an armature up in Shiftless's shadow, got out a big lump of clay, worked it pliable, and began blocking out a head and face. After Lonnie had finished with the dishes, he spent an hour polishing Shiftless, but being very careful not to get in my way. Then he began scouting around through the brush and lugging in armfuls of firewood. By 10 o'clock he had as much as we could have used in a week. He knew it as well as I did, but he was so anxious to show me he was carrying out his end of our deal that he kept right on lugging. I didn't even look up at him when he passed me with an armful of wood. I didn't need to. I knew his face so well that I could have made a model of it with my eyes closed, and he didn't pay any attention to what I was doing either until I'd gone about as far as I could without him. Then he called, "Cheapers, buddy, I didn't know you had another job ahead. Where'd you get it?" "I found it last night," I called back. "Come on over here." When Lonnie came over to see what I wanted, I told him, "You're working too hard, buddy boy. Sit down and rest yourself a while. I just had a bright idea, and we can talk about it while I'm fiddling with this thing." I knew better than to let him see the face I was working on because he'd have recognized it as his own, and I knew better than to tell him I wanted him to pose for me because I'd get everything in the world except the animated expression I wanted. The only way I could get that would be by keeping him entirely unself-conscious, and by telling him whatever was necessary to make him bubble with happiness at the time I needed it. So as he slumped down in the shade of a bush near me, I turned the back of the model toward him and moved the box I was sitting on so I could see his face right beyond that of the model. I managed to get the animated expression every time I needed it, but sometimes I had to go nearly overboard to get it. The worst mistake I made was in telling them that if he could pay in the $85 I'd originally paid for Shiftless before we reached Santa Fe, I'd have her taken out of my name entirely and registered in his. When you're busy on something you like to do, or when you're listening to things you like to hear, hours go by as if they were minutes. When I started on the model that morning, I'd told myself I was going to make the best sample I possibly could, but I forgot all about its being a sample as soon as Lonnie came over there. It couldn't have been more than half an hour before I noticed that the clay face was beginning to come alive, as Ivan's always were. I didn't know where the time went from then on, but we never thought about lunch, and the sun was way over toward the western mountains when I said, "Take a look here, Lonnie, and see how you'd like to sling plaster into this old buzzard's face." We couldn't have had a better salesman than Lonnie's happy likeness. He was so proud of it that the animated look always came back to his face whenever I had him bring it to show a banker, and I never failed to get an order after he'd shown it. Of course, I had to work out a system where he brought his bust in, showed it, and took it back out to Shiftless. Then I went on and made my deal with the client. They were all the same, a marble-like bust made from a picture taken at any age and a payment of $25 if it was satisfactory when completed. There was only one part of my original plan that didn't work out. It wouldn't do for me to let 2 or 3 more clients come to see me on the same day. I could do a good job only if I had my client come to me in the morning, visited with him till I had every detail of his features and expressions in my mind, then went right on to work on the clay model while the memory was still sharp and clear in my head. I never had but one refusal, and that was when I tried to carry 3 likenesses in my mind at the same time. I always took the pictures, but I looked at them only enough to be sure I was right on the combing of the hair and whether or not to put on a mustache. There were a dozen towns within 30 miles of our first central camp between El Paso and Las Cruces, and there were 3 $50 bills in the cuff of my Levi's when we broke camp and headed on up the Rio Grande. Besides that, Lonnie had turned in $40 toward his ownership of Shiftless. For the next 2 days, our road was on the west side of the Rio Grande, parallel to the Jornada del Muerto on the east side of the river, the journey of death on the old Spanish trail. We passed through 4 or 5 towns before we reached Socorro, one of them good-sized, but we didn't stop because they were all isolated. We did have a little excitement, though. About halfway between Hot Springs and Socorro, we saw a small band of horses grazing through the brush over toward the San Mateo Mountains. They were less than a quarter mile from the road, and Lonnie and I got the same idea at the same time. We'd had our saddles and cowhand outfits for more than 2 months and had never had a minute's use of them. And with the way things were going for the cowboy artists of the Southwest, it didn't seem as if we were apt to for some time. We'd barely come in sight of the horses when Lonnie let out a war whoop and shouted, "Let's go ride 'em, buddy!" "One's enough for me, you ride the rest," I yelled back, and Lonnie pulled off the road. We'd been traveling in our cut-off jeans, so we had to change into our cowhand duds, but we put everything on, bandana and all. While we were changing, Lonnie told me, "'Member, buddy, how we caught the old cow Christmas Day? It'll be a cinch to catch horses the same way, only easier, 'cause this brush ain't so tall and I can drive right on over it." If we hadn't yelled so loud when we first spied those horses, we might have had better luck with them, but by the time we'd changed our clothes, they'd drifted on another quarter mile. With me perched on the running board and lashed to a top iron, Lonnie took off across the desert with Shiftless bucking like a Brahma bull. He didn't turn out for anything until we were closing in behind a little band of racing horses, and I had to hold on so tight that I could neither build a loop in my rope or get a decent look at the horses. When I got it, I thought for a few seconds it was going to be my last look at anything on earth. The band took a sudden turn to the left, and Lonnie forgot he was mounted on Shiftless instead of a horse. He turned her right on the heels of the frightened Mustangs. Shiftless sort of hunkered down on her forehead the way a horse will when he tries to make too sharp a turn on the wrong lead, but she didn't go end over end as a horse often will. She rocked toward me till I'll swear my face wasn't a foot off the ground. Then Lonnie jerked the wheel in the opposite direction and Shiftless went on a dance, about the kind a drunk might do on a pogo stick. The first 8 or 10 hops, I don't believe she ever touched more than one wheel to the ground, but lunged and tipped from side to side and front to back. By the time Lonnie got her back under control, the horses were long gone, and I'd had all the bronco busting I wanted for one day. We finished out February and the first half of March in 2 central camps, one between Socorro and Albuquerque, the other between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and we did better than I dared to hope. The only trouble was that, skinny as I was, I nearly froze to death. We'd come far enough north and high enough that the nights were often bitter cold, and there were a lot of days when my hands would get so numb I'd have to stop every 10 or 15 minutes to warm them. Of course, I couldn't work in my cut-off jeans, and I couldn't do my best work because the clay stiffened too much to handle well. I think it was a combination of cold evenings, Lonnie's not having enough to do to keep him from being bored, and curiosity that made us into movie fans. Ever since we'd seen that movie in El Paso with the horsefall strip in it, I'd been anxious to see another, hoping I might see one with me in it. If on an evening that was too cold for me to work, and often on ones that weren't, we found there was going to be a cowboy and Indian picture in one of the nearby towns, we'd hide our stuff away in the brush, wind Shiftless up, and go to see it. With 2 exceptions, I think we saw every cowboy and Indian picture that came within 50 miles of us, and those 2 exceptions were Albuquerque and Santa Fe. I learned my lesson about Lonnie in big cities when we were in El Paso, and though I had to get a bit tough a couple of times, I kept him away from both cities till I'd finished the last job in our second camp. And here they are trying to lasso horses from a car.
Can you show them too?
Yes, I'm going to show them too. There they are trying to lasso a horse from a car. As I'd written Mother, I'd planned that we'd be all spring on the way from El Paso to Santa Fe, and that I'd go to Colorado from there. But while we were in our second camp, I changed my mind. There were several reasons for it. In the first place, it would be colder in Colorado than in New Mexico, and it would be too early for the spring cattle work to have opened up. In the second place, I was having too much fun and making too much money to quit the plaster bust business. It seemed to me that if our luck held out and we kept away from big cities, I might have nearly $1,000 tucked away in the cuffs of my Levi's by the end of June. Then when I went to meet Ted Hawkins and my old Colorado friends at the Littleton Roundup on the 4th of July, I wouldn't be going just as a cowhand looking for a job. There was plenty of good grazing land in Colorado that could be bought for $5 or $6 an acre, and I'd be able to start out as a small rancher, maybe with a quarter section of good pasture land near the mountains and a dozen or two head of young stock. At first I thought about taking Lonnie into partnership with me, and then I decided that might be a mistake. It would be better to sell him the idea of going back to his folks in Wyoming. I was sure he'd never willingly give up Shiftless, and without the bust business, I couldn't afford to support both of them. Of course, I didn't tell Lonnie all my plans. It would only have hurt his feelings. Instead, I kept dangling the ownership of Shiftless before his eyes to keep him away from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and from spending all his share from the business on girls. I promised him, though, that if we'd go into Santa Fe for just one day to register Shiftless in his name if he had her paid for, then we'd head south again where the weather was warmer. With mine having taken Lonnie to the movies nearly every evening, and threatening to drive Shiftless myself if he left camp without my say-so, he hadn't had much chance to blow money on the girls. Soon after we'd moved to the camp near Santa Fe, he cleaned up the last of the $85 that I'd promised would make Shiftless his. From then on, he was restless as a caged coyote, begging me every day to lay off so we could go to town and have the registration put into his name. I knew well enough what would happen if I did it, so I wouldn't go till the last job was finished, and even then I made him promise that he'd leave without any argument after we'd spent one day in the city. When we did go, I had nearly $100 in my pocket and 8 50s folded into the cuffs of my Levi's. How much is 8 $50 bills, Eva?
400.
You got it, $400. It didn't take much figuring for me to know that Lonnie had a pocket roll almost as big as mine. If he'd swiped as many chickens as I suspected, his share of the gas and grub bill hadn't been more than $10 for all the time since we'd left El Paso. It was early in the forenoon when we drove into Santa Fe, but Lonnie insisted on going straight to the motor vehicle office and having Shiftless registered in his name. The minute the clerk gave him the ownership paper, he forgot that he wasn't a millionaire. While I was registering at the hotel desk, he tipped one bellboy $1 to lug our stuff up to the room, and gave another $1 to have his suit pressed in a hurry. By the time I got upstairs, he had shucked off his shirt and Levi's, left them where they had fallen, and was taking a bath. He called to me above the splashing, "Listen, buddy, I aim to keep that promise I made you. You know a day don't end till midnight." "Yes, I know it," I called back, "but you'll be broke long before supper time, and don't come trying to borrow from me, because I'm not going to lend you a dime. If you had $1,000, you'd blow it on the floozies in a couple of hours." "You're wrong, buddy, you're dead wrong," he shouted. "Ain't you took note how I've been saving my dough lately? This time I don't aim to spend more than a $5. Just ride around a little to look the town over, then maybe take in a movie. I'll have old Shiftless waiting outside the front door at straight up midnight. Is that fair enough?" "Fair enough," I told him, "but don't wait for me down there. I'll be sleeping. All I care about is getting away early tomorrow morning." While Lonnie was getting dressed and away, I sent my own suit down to be pressed, then hung up the clothes he'd shed, and straightened up the stuff the bellboy had dumped in the middle of the floor. I put our bedrolls in a far corner, laid the saddles and outfits on top of them, then set my armatures, supplies, and toolbox at one side. When my suit came back, I changed into it, put the loose change and small bills in my pocket, and hung my Levi's in the closet beside Lonnie's. Even by feeling the cuffs, nobody would have guessed that mine weren't as empty as his. It was a warm, sunny forenoon, so I went out to order an additional supply of clay and plaster of Paris, then wandered around the street sort of aimlessly, and just by chance I found the post office. Since I'd written Mother that I wouldn't reach Santa Fe till late spring, I didn't expect to find a letter waiting for me at general delivery, but there was one there. If I'd used my head, I would have known there would be. That Dr. Gagan would have known where I was every week by the report cards from doctors I had gone to for checkups, and that he'd have told her. He had, and she was worried sick. She wrote that she was afraid I'd lost my job with the big cattle company or that I'd had to quit because of my health. She was frightened because I'd slipped to 101 pounds instead of gaining, and she was even more frightened because I'd sent $60 home at the end of February. She said she must insist on a full and honest explanation as to how I was getting hold of any such large sums of money. I'd written Mother so many lies that I wasn't sure I could remember them all, so when I'd sent her the 50 and 10 at the end of February, I'd written a very short note just saying I was feeling fine, that the weather was nice, and asked about each one at home. Then I'd crossed the river and mailed the letter from Guinea, a little town about 30 miles north of Socorro, and so small I was sure she wouldn't be able to find it on a map. Before answering the letter, I took it back to our room and thought about it for a while. It was certain that Mother was already suspicious about what I'd been writing to her, but if I should become a quarter of an inch nearer the truth, she'd be even more suspicious. There was nothing to do except make up some more fairy tales, but I tried to make them sound as reasonable as I could. After a few paragraphs about the great confidence our bosses had in my working partner Alonzo and me, I wrote that we'd been sent ahead of the herd again to buy more cattle, and that the extra money was from bonuses we were being paid when we made exceptionally fine bargains in our buying. Near the end of the letter, I said that our boss's only disappointment was the scarcity of good cattle, that they wanted to gather a much larger herd, and so were sending us back into southeastern New Mexico to do more buying. I didn't dare put any money in that letter, but I said I'd write again when I got my paycheck at the end of the next month, adding that I had hopes of a real good bonus that time. There wasn't much to do after I'd written the letter, so I spent the afternoon around the plaza looking through the old buildings that still remained from the early Spanish days. I'd just come out of the museum late in the afternoon when I caught a glimpse of Shiftless. Lonnie was tooling her through the plaza as proudly as if she'd been a Rolls Royce. He had a gaily dressed black-haired senorita beside him and two more on the back seat. They were all laughing and merry, but didn't seem a bit rough or coarse. And here is Lonnie and his senoritas driving through town.
What are senoritas?
Spanish ladies.
Oh, I didn't know that senoritas were Spanish ladies.
Yep. After I'd found a restaurant with food I could eat, I went out to a movie and didn't get back to the hotel until nearly midnight, but Lonnie had been there ahead of me. His saddle and outfit were gone from the top of his bedroll, but everything else was just as I'd left it. I don't know when he sneaked in, but he was asleep in a chair when I woke up the next morning. I let him sleep till I was shaved and dressed. Then when I shook him awake, he looked up sheepishly and said, "Honest, buddy, I didn't." "Never mind the excuses," I cut in. "Just get into your old duds and lug this stuff down to Shiftless. But you'd better give me the pawn ticket before you change. I'll redeem your saddle and outfit on our way out of town." And that is the end of the chapter. So that's it for chapter 17.
Aww.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.